Hi, this is Mrs. Clark and welcome to my video on rate of change. In your rate of change organizer, we're going to start with writing our main idea, rate of change in the center. And then we're going to go up here and we're going to fill in the definition. So one of the many definitions of rate of change is the ratio of the change in the dependent variable to the change in the independent variable. So a ratio is something that we think of in simple terms as, if I'm opening a bag of M&Ms, how many red M&Ms are there to how many blue M&Ms there are. So there's, for every 2 red M&Ms, there are 3 blue M&Ms or something like that. That's a ratio. You've heard those problems a lot in middle school. The ratio of sugar to flour in the recipe is 1 cup of sugar for every 2 cups of flour, things like that. Ratios can mean lots of things. A lot of times we think of them as a fraction. So one of the ideas that we think about when we think of rate of change is writing this definition in a fraction form. So we use this triangle symbol. It's a Greek symbol, a Greek letter actually, called delta. And this can be the fraction of the change in the dependent variable over the change in the independent variable. So this delta means change. This fraction is our ratio. So I'm going to make a note of that right here. So delta, this Greek letter delta means change. You've seen that in science probably before. I believe also the airline Delta uses a triangle somewhere in its logo. You're going to see that in science a lot more often, probably. And then you also have this fraction bar, which is division, which means our ratio. So we've talked about rate of change often in math. We talk about it in many different ways. So rate of change is just how something is changing compared to how something else is changing. So we talk about it in word problems. We talk about it on the graph. We talk about it in just numbers. If I'm thinking about coordinates, we can think about it in more of a numerical way instead of dependent and independent variables. We can think of it on our coordinate plane. We can think of it as the change in y over the change in x. So when we use this term, rate of change, we also have to remember that the word rate is how much is one thing changing in the way that another thing is changing. And that is what we mean when we say the word slope. So you've probably heard of slope before. I'm sure you have. What we mean when we say slope. So we talk about slope. We can calculate slope as just numbers. We can calculate it on a graph. We can look for it in an equation. We can find out about it in a word problem. But when I use the words rate of change, it's the same thing as slope. It's just a different way of describing it. So slope is generally just the numbers part, but rate of change kind of includes the units that we're talking about. Down here, we're going to fill in one more way of looking at rate of change, and that is when we're looking at a graph. We would be looking at the rise, which is our up and down motion, rise or fall technically, over the run, which is our left to right motion. I usually run to the right, the way you read a graph. So we have our rise over run, which is how I look at it on a graph. We have our change in y over change in x, which is how I would look at it with some points. We have our change in the dependent variable over the change in the independent variable. That could be the graph, that could be looking at points, that could be from a table, could be from a word problem. But one thing that's important to note and to remember is that units matter. So when I'm talking about rate of change, I have to remember that it's important not just to give the number that is the rate, but also to talk about the units. So it could be something like miles per hour. That's a unit. So 5 miles per hour. That's an example. 5 miles per hour, that's our unit. So our miles and our hours are our unit. It would mean a ratio of 5 miles for 1 hour. Anytime I see the word per, that tells me it's for 1. I'll make a note of that here too. For 1. Great. All right, so go ahead and glue this into your notebook, and then you may move on to the next thing. Thanks for watching.